Good evening, friends. There we go. Sorry about that. Welcome to this year's second faculty book talk at Books and Books. I'm Phil Harling. I'm the director for the Center of the Humanities, and it's lovely to see you here tonight. And I'm just going to very briefly introduce our introducer, and then we can relatively quickly, get on with the main event. So it's my privilege to introduce Logan Connors, who's a professor of modern languages and literatures. He researches French lit, mainly theater, from roughly 1650 to 1815, as well as topics in theater and performance studies, the history of the emotions, and comparative revolution studies, and is, I think, the sometime collaborator as well as friend of the person he's going to be introducing in just a moment. So thank you, Logan.
Thank you. As Phil mentioned, my name is Logan Connors, and I'm the chair of the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, or as we like to call ourselves, the History Department's wilder and more fun sister department. A few weeks ago at the first Humanities book talk, it was actually one of my colleagues who gave a book talk, and the person who introduced him, Philip Carter, I liked the way that he introduced my colleague Andrew Lynch. He said that, so Philip made the remark that one of his goals upon arriving in Miami was to meet Andrew, somebody whose work he had read, who had been spoken about highly by colleagues, somebody he already admired before setting foot in South Florida. And so this is exactly, it resonated with me, and it's something that I felt when I thought about Ashli White when I arrived at UM over 7 years ago. I met Ashli first through her writing, and more specifically by reading her monumental study of how the Haitian Revolution influenced the early United States. Ashli's first monograph, Encountering Revolution, Haiti and the Making of the Early Republic, details the ways by which refugees from Saint-Domingue, the French colony's name before the French were kicked out in what would become the Haitian Revolution, how they shaped the early American Republic in various ways. Encountering Revolution is a masterclass of several historiographical traditions and specializations, including, of course, U.S. history, but also Caribbean history, French history, transatlantic history, or Atlantic studies. And that book, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, went on to win the Gilbert Chinard Prize for Most Outstanding Book on France and the Americas from the Society for French Historical Studies and the Institut Français d'Amérique, a tremendous feat. I don't know, maybe even a controversial one. I don't know if the Society for French Historical Studies has ever bestowed its Most Treasured Book Award on someone who identifies quite modestly as a U.S. historian. But the book was immensely popular among historians and cultural studies people, and I actually came across it in an early modern studies reading group at my previous institution. And there, as soon as colleagues knew that I was moving to the University of Miami, several people, and again from different disciplines, a 19th century American literature scholar, a theater scholar, a historian of the French Revolution, they told me that whatever happens, I had to meet Ashli White. She's a, quote, very serious scholar, one said. Yeah. You know, as someone who studies emotion and affect, performance, I recognize the sort of polysemy of those terms and how serious can hover delicately, even dangerously, between impressive or frightening, or maybe just boring. But also maybe aloof or distant. What was she going to be like, I thought. Those of you who know Ashli well, and there are many, many colleagues and friends in the room, you know that the only word I just mentioned that links to Ashli is impressive. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters, and often in the most prestigious venues imaginable. Cambridge University Press, Early American Studies, Columbia University Press, etc. She has curated museum exhibitions, notably at UM's Low Art Museum. She's earned fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Alejandro Institute for Early American History, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Historical Society of Philadelphia. But she is never boring, aloof, or even frightening, although she's been chair for about a month. And so you might have to ask some of her colleagues. But she's incredibly generous with her time and her knowledge. She's a transformative teacher. We've shared some of the same students. I know this to be true, a dedicated advisor, a great colleague, and I suspect that she's a model departmental administrator. Long really is the list of her former students and colleagues who can testify to what appears to be a very natural mission to do what is right, to do what is fair and just, and to do it thoroughly and very efficiently. But enough blah blah about Ashli White. We're here because she's written another book. And this time she's revved up even more her transatlantic abilities to write revolutionary things, material culture, and politics in the late 18th-century Atlantic world. Fresh off the press from Yale. In some ways, this is a continuation of her work in encountering revolution, in that one of her goals is to show the connective tissue of the Atlantic world and contest the legacy of monolingual or nationalist bodies of historical scholarship that can lead to limited or inaccurate explanations. But this time, things are Ashli's thing, as she traces ceramics, furniture, maps, clothing, and other objects across the Atlantic world in the age of revolutions to show how people engaged with things. This process of embodied engagement was, of course, visceral, but it was also fundamentally political. I'm not going to say more about this spectacular book, because that's like the whole point of her thing, but I'm going to mention just here that Ashli really is calling into question some major claims about revolutionary change and about the influence of foundational documents and discourses on politics. And so I'll leave you instead with what the eminent professor of American history and of African and African American studies at Harvard, Vincent Brown, says about Ashli White's revolutionary things. Vincent Brown writes, quote, "Envisioning revolution as the turning of a wheel, a cycling and circulating material thing, rather than as a new beginning, offers fresh insights into how times of massive transformation can encompass enduring ways of life." White's vivid and deeply researched account of the Atlantic age of revolutions takes its shape from the contested meanings of objects made, disseminated, and used in ways that show how even the most successful revolts against empires could still leave people firmly within their orbit. So without further ado, Professor and Chair of History, Dr. Ashli White.
It's kind of hard now, actually. Thank you, Logan, and I do owe you beer. Thank you to the Center for the Humanities. Thank you to the former director, Hugh Thomas, who looks like the happiest person in the room today, to Phil Harling, the current director, to Oni, to Christina, and actually for all of you for being here, not just being here tonight, but many of you have been with this book for several years now, too. And so I just want to express my gratitude for being such a buoy during this project. But revolutionary things. So let's begin with a story, because that's what historians do, right? In the winter of 1791, authorities in northern Saint-Domingue were very interested in the contents of this man's luggage. That autumn, Vincent Auger and a group of like-minded free men of African descent had taken up arms. Their goal was to compel the colonial assembly to acknowledge the political rights granted to some black men by the revolutionary legislature in Paris. After a standoff of several weeks, the dissidents were apprehended, charged with insurrection, and condemned to execution. Before the sentence was carried out, however, government officials sought to learn more about the scope of the insurgents' designs. As part of their investigation into Auger, they searched his possessions and discovered things that, they suspected, had abetted his campaign. Authorities inventoried reformist pamphlets gathered during his recent stay in Paris, and they pressed him about weapons allegedly procured in Charleston, South Carolina. Given Auger's aim to extend rights by force to free men of African descent, the guns and revolutionary tracts were predictable. But investigators also inquired about objects that, from our vantage, are less expected. Early in the interview, they quizzed Auger about a trip to the Sèvres porcelain manufactory and the thousands of livres worth of coffee wares that he acquired there and then sold. They wondered how he had afforded such a hefty outlay, and if it was true that he had worn a National Guard uniform to the factory visit. At another session, they referenced his engraved portrait, which you see here, copies of which were in his bag. They wanted to find out whether he had devised the motto, quote, "He loves liberty and knows how to defend it," that encircles the silhouette. On one of the last days of questioning, they brought items in from his trunk, including several military garments that the clerk described in detail, right down to the imported metal buttons stamped with the arms of Paris. They concluded the show and tell by unveiling some pieces of jewelry, among which were, quote, 2 small ceramic medallions depicting a chained slave in bas-relief. In his responses, Auger downplayed the political significance of his things. He claimed that the jewelry was for his commercial work, that the Parisian printer had composed the slogan on his portrait, and that the uniforms were merely a requirement of his militia service. None were intended, as he put it, to excite revolt on the island. Authorities remained unconvinced by these denials, as Auger no doubt anticipated. Everyone in that interrogation room knew that these objects thrummed with meaning. But the officials' persistent questions and Auger's resolute disclaimers suggest that their revolutionary implications were up for discussion. These contentious exchanges encourage us to ask, how and why did these objects provoke such strong reactions? What do they reveal not only about Auger's quest for political rights, but about the power of material culture in the age of Atlantic revolutions more broadly? My book seeks to answer these questions for the American, French, and Haitian revolutions, political movements that generated radical new ideas and that influenced the production, circulation, and consumption of millions of things. I show that in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, material culture shaped in distinct ways how people understood vital keywords such as equality and freedom, and how they tried to promote and sometimes thwart the realization of these ideals on the ground. Crucially, these contests occurred at the level of everyday life. The clothes on people's backs, the plates from which they ate, the maps that guided their movements, and the diversions that amused them. And these engagements involved enslaved and free, women and men, poor and elite, whose encounters with objects were not limited to local concerns. Rather, through things, actors across the social spectrum contributed to transatlantic ideological disputes. To locate these contributions, Revolutionary Things reconsiders the intersection of politics and material culture. Typically, we assess the political potential of objects within the context of individual revolutions. But as Auger's case indicates, these movements transcended national borders, and so did material culture associated with them. So I track the trajectories, the Atlantic trajectories, of diverse categories of objects. Right? There are ceramics, metalware, and furniture, military clothing and accessories, maps, prints, that does not look like George Washington, and life-size wax figures. Now, some of these things originated at a revolutionary site and voyaged beyond it, while others were fabricated outside the United States, France, or Haiti, but referred to those places. So, for instance, British or American-made items about the French and Haitian revolutions. The political influence of these border-alighting objects differed from that of texts, and identifying their singular impact requires an active view of material culture. There is a tendency to see objects as straightforward badges of political positions, but objects do not simply transmit fixed messages. Material culture theorists and practitioners stress that people affect things, and that things affect lives in fundamental and sometimes unforeseen ways. To understand an object's political resonance, then, we need to pay closer attention to what is often called its materiality, which has several components. First, the traits unique to a type of object, military clothing versus printed portraits, for example, that figured in its specific political capacity. So I explore how uniforms engage with questions over equality, whereas printed portraits influence debates about popular sovereignty. Second, not only did different objects speak to different issues, but each category had limits that were distinct to its form as well. These bounds were structural, in terms of where and of what things were made. So an object's political possibilities were determined in part if it could be and was produced in Cap Français or Philadelphia or Paris, and whether it was comprised of cloth or paper or ceramic. The limits of revolutionary things were also socially constructed, in that people had thresholds for tolerating alterations to aspects of their material world and to those of others. Some individuals were more willing and more able to change their dress accessories than their dinnerware. And lastly, context affected political influence. An object could promote or check change depending on who acquired and used it, how, where, and to what ends. So a queensware platter owned by an enslaved person in Virginia had political valences distinct from one found in Duc d'Orléans' household. This tension across and within revolutionary things made them sites of contest, as people teased out political prospects and they encountered obdurate restrictions in the world of goods. I focus on this contest in the heat of the moment, from about 1770 to 1810, when participants and observers wrestled with events, agents, and ideas as they surfaced. The quick succession of these three revolutions, and in the case of France and Haiti, their contemporaneity, that facilitates our inquiry into the effects of objects on the revolutionary present, instead of their role in nationalism and commemorations of the revolutionary past. In so doing, I look to recover the dynamism of Atlantic revolutionary things for the many individuals who encountered them. To show this approach in action tonight, let me draw your attention to the book's cover, which I admit I think is really aesthetically lovely. But it also has an argument. In a work about revolutionary material culture, it is, I hope, not surprising to include a miniature of Toussaint Louverture. And this visual representation of the Haitian revolutionary leader fits nicely in the category of revolutionary things, as do the items that are featured in his portrait: the uniform, the cockade on his hat, the map in his hands. This Sèvres vase, which dates from 1779, seems like an outlier, however. When it comes to revolutionary ceramics, we might expect something more like this teapot on the left, or this plate on the right. Tonight, I want to make a case as to why this vase belongs next to the rendition of Toussaint Louverture, how this Ancien Regime object, along with others like it, redefines what was a revolutionary thing, and it helps us identify new and significant aspects of the politicization of objects in this era. Okay. The Sèvres vase is a prime example of a luxury good. Made of porcelain and decorated with gilt and deftly painted enamel scenes, it took years to fabricate. And only the very wealthiest, in this case Louis XVI, could afford it. Right? And actually he's Louis XVI, so he bought a pair of them. Right? As you do. All right, luxury came under fire during the Age of Revolutions, as reformers decried such items as visible manifestations of the decadence that corrupted political systems. In some instances, Republicans destroyed fine furnishings as they ransacked the properties of rulers, officials, and other political foes. This iconoclasm has received a lot of scholarly attention to illustrate how revolutionaries were determined to sweep out the old and bring in the new. And yet, the Sèvres vase, which graced the council room at Versailles, it endured the revolution, as did heaps of other high-style furnishings affiliated with ancien regimes. Their continued presence was essential to revolutions, in part because of their value. And so this evening we'll examine how conceptions of the value of luxury goods encouraged their appropriation by revolutionaries who attempted to repurpose them for radical, if often unstable, ends. So recall how Auger financed his military endeavor in Saint-Domingue. He purchased coffee wares at Sèvres and then resold them in Paris. This practice of acquiring and reselling desirable decorative wares was pervasive among other soldiers at the time, but with one exception. While Auger bought goods from the manufactory, armies and navies frequently plundered them from their enemies. During the Revolutionary Wars, as with other armed conflicts, governments encouraged pillaging within certain parameters because it debilitated and humiliated foes, and the spoils helped to underwrite the victors' campaigns. Militaries, for instance, seized items of immediate use to their forces, things like ammunition, food, horses, right? But they also gathered other materials with an eye to their saleability on the second-hand market. In the early modern period, the trade in previously owned items was as substantial in terms of volume and worth as the retail market, and some scholars speculate that the sale of old wares surpassed that of new. Not all of this activity resulted from plunder, but the lively second-hand market supplied a ready and familiar mechanism through which to dispense with and profit from goods seized in wartime. As one auctioneer explained, quote, "A British military invasion proclaims a kind of fair, which is welcome in the West Indies. The variety of things arriving for sale and the wider markets open to produce increase circulation." During the revolutions, militaries looked to plunder goods that would maximize revenue, and enemy merchants were a tempting target. When the British seized the Dutch colony of St. Eustatius during the American Revolution, soldiers raided warehouses for tropical produce, casks of sugar, coffee, and tobacco, which they could be consumed by armies or they hawked them, right? They also collected silk gloves, girls' Morocco pumps, petticoats, shoe buckles, parcels of lace and ribbons, napkins and tablecloths, and 25 shirts trimmed with stitched cambric ruffles. Okay? In this print, you can see Rodney, who's the Sir Admiral Rodney. He's actually hawking a shoe buckle, right? Which is true to form. We usually do not think of military men collecting petticoats and ruffled shirts as plunder, but they sought them out because they sold well on the second-hand market. While merchant stock might have been easy pickings, the same calculus informed seizures of property from private estates. So in North America, patriots confiscated and sold household goods of suspected loyalists. Martha Phillips of Boston submitted a list to the Loyalist Claims Commission for over 500 pounds worth of property, and that included pictures gilt-framed and glazed, china and glass, and 24 walnut chairs. In these scenarios, the identification of elite trappings came at the behest of officers, men of standing who were familiar with the ins and outs of the world, of the consumer's world. Right? Yet evidence suggests that when it comes to plundering, people at various social levels understood the value of diverse goods. Take, for example, the case of ordinary soldiers. In the aftermath of battles, men inevitably lifted items for themselves, and the individuals affected decried these appropriations as unjust and cited them as evidence of the moral waywardness of plunderers, which did have political currency in an age of revolutions. But for our purposes, these episodes reveal how members of the lower sort knew the value and resale potential of luxury items. In the fall of 1776, General George Washington heard scores of complaints about plundering by his men. In one case, a group of foot soldiers ransacked a house, taking with them, among other objects, 4 large pier looking glasses, massive mirrors, right? Which the reporting officer remarked, quote, "One would think could be of no earthly use to them." When ordered to return the goods, the ringleader refused to do so and swore that he would, quote, defend them at the hazard of his life. Right? So this incident shows how the acquisition of high-style goods had the potential to upset social hierarchies, as these men not only demonstrated their awareness of luxury items, but also claimed their rights to them. The political significance of appropriation and resale was even more powerful in the case of black men. Throughout the Age of Revolutions, observers tried to deny that black people had knowledge of material culture typically associated with the master class, and that the actions of black people belie this denial. In North America, black loyalist soldiers took, quote, everything valuable from patriot homes. In one instance, this included bedding, wearing apparel, liquors, and a watch. During the Haitian Revolution, white Saint-Dominguans griped about losing clothing, silver, and books to black revolutionaries. In the fall of 1791, a colonist returned to his plantation to find that rebels had destroyed everything except one building, which was inhabited by a local leader of the insurrection. The formerly enslaved had stocked it with the planter's best furniture, all of which, according to him, was, quote, carefully maintained. Right? A clear sign that people of African descent recognized its worth. This display of familiarity with the value of luxury goods challenged racist notions that denigrated the capacity of people of African descent to comprehend the so-called finer points of civilization. It also mattered how these items were taken. In the Age of Revolutions, white observers often portrayed the military maneuvers of black people as wild abandon, again, in an effort to uphold racial hierarchical fictions and to argue against emancipation. Sensitive to these depictions, black armies in revolutionary Saint-Domingue organized plundering as much as possible. During the Battle of Le Cap in 1793, men of African descent systematically emptied the richest storehouses of the city. A Boston merchant who witnessed the event described its meticulous coordination, in which long lines of mules were brought to the port and black troops oversaw their unloading. He wrote, "The whole bay, for nearly 3/4 of a mile, was stripped of its merchandise, and other parts of the town were doubtless plundered in the same manner." So rather than unbridled looting, black armies selected and gathered what they wanted in an orderly fashion, and to good effect, as estimates of this single episode's take reached 10,000 livres. Like their white counterparts, black armies sold these items to support their aims, and in the case of Saint-Domingue, one outlet for these goods was neighboring Santo Domingo. In the early days of the Revolution, black armies carried plunder to Spanish authorities in exchange for war materiel. Colonial officials promoted the practice, hoping that black forces would undercut French control to such an extent that the Spanish could swoop in and conquer the entire island. But black armies had their own agendas when it came to leveraging plunder. When Spanish colonial administrators could not keep pace with black troops' demands for supplies, they began to sell items directly to Cuban soldiers who were stationed in Santo Domingo. These men bought thousands of pesos worth of furniture, jewels, plate, and even sugar processing equipment, all pillaged from estates and warehouses in Saint-Domingue. On the one hand, the sales speak to black soldiers' savviness about what was viable on the second-hand market and how to take advantage of that arena to support a political and military cause determined to overturn the planters' world in Saint-Domingue. On the other hand, the subversive potential was circumscribed, in that buyers used these items, like sugar equipment shipped from Hispaniola to Cuba, to bolster slavery elsewhere. As this case suggests, the political resonances of pillaged goods continued after their sale. While all three revolutions distributed items across borders, the French revolutionary confiscations afford the best opportunity to explore the implications of consumption of pillaged goods. And this is for two reasons. Right? The quantity of goods seized and their appeal among a certain subset of consumers in Europe and the Americas. Beginning in late 1789, the French government impounded the real and movable property of the Catholic Church. And as the revolution radicalized, the net widened to include emigres and political criminals, some of whom were the wealthiest men and women in France. The most high-profile example was the royal family. The contents of their chateau, Versailles, Fontainebleau, among others, became the property of the nation, or as the French called them, the biens nationaux, national goods. The windfall was enormous, as millions of luxury goods entered public coffers. Some items were earmarked as cultural patrimony and were transferred to a central depot in Paris with the intention that they would be preserved and displayed for the people's edification. So the Louvre, once a private palace, was transformed into a public museum in 1793 for just this purpose. But the pressure of goods was enormous, and the regime was strapped for cash. And so it decided to sell many items at auction. And here's one of the advertisements for a sale at Each Administrators couched these sales in patriotic terms, calling on French people to purchase wares to support the nation. Despite these appeals, the local consumer base could not absorb the massive quantity of items, and the regime turned to foreign buyers who, they reasoned, would introduce stable currency into an economy suffering from ever-increasing levels of inflation. Consumers throughout the Atlantic world snapped up these wares in the 1790s. To be sure, these auctions targeted well-heeled clientele, which is one of the reasons we can trace them. They were prized among bidders then and by collectors ever since. Nevertheless, thanks to the French Revolution, these luxury goods became accessible to a wider swath of buyers. The new owners were still elites, but often inspiring ones, and several were avowed Republicans. Some eager purchasers were on the spot ready to make the most of the bonanza, but French merchants also offered to ship items abroad. Citoyen Hilbert, Paris Decorateur, he placed items in German newspapers, emphasizing that he offered superior confiscated items at modest prices. Extant networks of trade expedited the movement of these wares as well. Throughout the 1790s, James Christie, the famous London auctioneer, used his professional contacts to ensure a steady supply of confiscated items. In his catalogs from the 1790s, he advertised Madame Duver's diamonds, which you can see here, bronze statues saved from the Tuileries, and other items that had been owned by household royalist names from the French Revolution. The sale of biens nationaux created opportunities for establishing new channels of Atlantic circulation. Consider the dealings of the merchant James Swan. A Scotsman who had migrated to Massachusetts during the North American colonial crisis, Swan threw himself into political ventures, joining the Sons of Liberty and serving in the state legislature and war board. By 1791, he had moved to Paris, where he parlayed his Republican credentials into commercial gains. Swan proposed that his firm could facilitate the importation of food and stores to France from the United States in exchange for access to and permission to export biens nationaux. Through this arrangement, Swan shuttled shiploads of French luxury goods to buyers everywhere from Boston to Norfolk. As part of the deal, Swan purchased a cache of spectacular items for his home back in Dorchester. So he bought the pair of large set vases that, like Louis XVI, Swan needed two. He bought a marble-top console table, a mahogany fall front desk instead of chest of drawers, which you can see here, a pair of gilt bronze andirons, those are like hairy goats, a marble and gilt bronze mantel clock, and an entire suite of bedroom furniture, right? All of which you can see at the MFA Boston today. Now, we might be tempted to chalk up Swan's spending spree, as well as those of many others, to greed. right? When individuals encountered so many amazing items at bargain prices, political principles caved to consuming desires and social aspirations, right? These motivating factors, they were at play. But this explanation stopped short of appreciating the political associations that traveled with these objects into their new settings. The revolutions that had made them available were hard to shake, and yet they were also hard to pin down, revealing at once the instability and the power of these things. A brief comparison between British and U.S. consumers helps us see this dynamic in action. As Christie's dealings suggest, Britain was an active outlet for biens nationaux. Although sworn enemies of France for most of the 18th century, if not longer, right, British consumers still admired French high style. And this veneration did not wane during the French Revolution. Some observers criticized the British elite for their Francophilia, but after 1793, with the execution of Louis XVI and the French declaration of war on Britain, buyers could claim a political impetus for their purchases. They justified their tastes as a sign of solidarity with the ever-dwindling pool of French royals and for monarchy more generally. Moreover, they argued it was a way of ridding France of its cultural spoils, and cheaply at that, right? None other than the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, was swept up in the frenzy. He obtained numerous pieces and piles of furniture that he would eventually install at Windsor Castle. The experiences of Gouverneur Morris illustrate some of the political reverberations of French things in the United States. Morris, the one who's seated, he served as U.S. Minister to France during the Terror, and he purchased several items from Versailles while in Paris. He bought a musical clock and sewing table, which he shipped to Robert and Mary Morris. Robert is standing there, no relation, in Philadelphia. And the clock was such a sensation that city residents went to see it at a local shop of a clockmaker, just going to check it out. For himself, Gouverneur Morris acquired a suite of furniture, at least 2 sofas, several armchairs, one of which you see here, and a screen. And these had outfitted one of the cabinets in Marie Antoinette's private apartments. Morris's Versailles purchases appeared in the parlor of his estate, Mauriciana, located in what is now the South Bronx. And its display in the most public room of his house invites several interpretations. Its conspicuous placement may have been Morris's way of honoring the French-U.S. alliance of 1778. Yet Morris was well aware of the dramatic changes in France that had made the Versailles suite available, namely the demise of the monarch who had allied with the United States. What's more, in the spring of 1789, Morris had professed his disdain for the opulence of Versailles, indignant over the royal family's willful ignorance of how their lavish spending had contributed to the financial crisis. As the revolution deepened, Morris wondered whether the king, for all his good intentions, was up to the task of, quote, securing the liberty of France. And at several moments he lamented Marie Antoinette's imprudent conduct. At the same time, Morris criticized the revolutionaries, detailing in his diary and official correspondence their intrigues and rash decisions and the general chaos they had unleashed. At the end of 1792, Morris penned an in-depth appraisal of the French Revolution, in which almost all participants shared the blame. Revolutionaries of all stripes, the royal family, courtiers, and the populace, among others. The problem, in Morris's estimation, was that the French were not ready for the revolution they had inaugurated and perpetuated. In this context, Morris's Versailles suite takes on many more possible meanings. It represented the recklessness of the former owner, as well as that of the revolutionaries from moderate to radical who brought her down. It served as a poignant reminder of how quickly one's political and personal fortunes could turn. Or perhaps Morris agreed with Thomas Jefferson, who thought that Americans should only imbibe French culture once their moral compasses were fully forged at home. In this vein, Morris could have seen himself as preserving for Americans the very thing most valuable from France, its culture, a move not so distant from British counterparts. The practice of pillaging sent millions of old regime goods in motion during the age of Atlantic revolutions, and the sheer volume broadened the range of revolutionary things that inhabitants encountered. While none of these items was explicitly Republican in aesthetics, they elicited discussions about revolutions because of the context surrounding their seizures, sales, and uses. There's a temptation to dismiss these secondhand goods as holdovers from another era, but this explanation falls prey to the period's polarizing rhetoric that tried to cast individuals as either for or against the status quo. Political allegiances on the ground, even among revolutionaries like Morris, were much less stable. In fact, the starkness of the rhetoric can be attributed to the need to clarify allegiances. So if, for example, the iconography of liberty, equality, and fraternity that showed up on faience and furniture and other items, if that represented the ideal, what revolutionaries wanted to achieve, then these old goods encapsulated the messiness of the revolutionary present and how much remained unresolved. For us, they offer insight into the contingency of the moment as individuals struggled to make sense of the revolutions as they occurred. And they point to the ways that material continuity perpetuated revolutionary change and shaped how various individuals understood the context of that change. So in closing, I hope I've convinced you that a Louis XVI Sèvres vase belongs on this book cover, although it's not going to change, alongside the Toussaint Louverture miniature. What might seem like a juxtaposition is a truer reflection of the diverse types of things that held political currency in this era. And there's one more argument in this pairing. The vase depicts a scene from the life of Belisarius, a brilliant and tenacious general who served in the Byzantine Empire during the reign of Justinian I, and who was wrongfully charged and imprisoned for conspiracy. 18th century French elites embraced a romanticized version of Belisarius' biography, seeing it as a sign of fortitude in the face of unjust circumstances. When this vase stood at Versailles, Louis XVI drew a parallel between himself and this hero. But the orientation of the book cover suggests that Toussaint Louverture is actually the more fitting exemplar. The central goal of this book is to encourage new questions about material culture, an endeavor which I think is imperative for understanding this historic watershed. A material view is important because things were, and they still are, vital to human existence. One could argue more so than texts, the usual source for history of revolutionary politics. Whether enslaved or free, poor or elite, male or female, late 18th century individuals lived in material worlds in which people acted on things and were affected by them too. And so given this fundamental condition, we cannot comprehend the achievements or the limitations of this defining era without taking the consequences of things very seriously. Logan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ashli. If we can get this one to work.
I can take that.
There we go. There we go. Questions for Ashli? The floor is open, and I'll pass this around to her inquisitors.
That was amazing, Ashli.
Thank you
So much.
Thanks.
I have a question about sources and how you followed the objects. And obviously it's different for each of them and depending on what kind it is and to whom it went and so forth. But it just seems like it would be such a sort of myriad of different ways to trace it. So I'm just curious to hear about what some of those were.
Right. Should I? Do you want me, Mike? Do you care?
What would you like?
Oh, okay. So it took a lot. So I would say that's the reason why this book took so long. So what I started with was what I knew remained, right? And the high style things are obviously easier to find for certain reasons. But actually, the material footprint of the age of revolutions for many of the kinds of things that are in the book, uniforms, for example, sort of the most common things don't survive as often. So I looked at archaeological digs, I looked at any kind of provenance I could find for the types of objects that I was interested in exploring. And then for as many shortcomings as there are in the archival record, they were actually really critical for giving me a sense of the volume of scale for all those things that did not remain. So in the book, I put objects that do remain in conversation with the many, many things that do not, in order to try to create a fuller picture of the landscape of things in which these 18th century actors lived, but for which we have very few traces. So it's a bit of a recovery, and depending on the object type, some are easier to follow than others. Thank you.
Just a quick question. You mentioned objects that were maybe created in England or in the United States or in France, but about the Haitian Revolution. Mm-hmm. Can you say what those objects were?
Sure. So in the landscape of the power structure of things, one conclusion that emerges pretty quickly is there are many fewer things that survived for the Haitian Revolution, for all of the ways that revolution was treated at the time and subsequently, but also because of the power structures of Atlantic production. So that formerly enslaved people in the thicker revolution in Saint-Domingue didn't necessarily have at their hands the means of production for certain types of goods to push out their vision of what revolution should be. So instead, what you see are centers of production, whether those be in especially London and Paris, or Europe more broadly, and to a lesser extent the United States, commenting on what they're seeing through things. And the things that I found most often being made outside about the Haitian Revolution would be prints, engravings of certain types. I focus on the prints of people. There are maps, too, which introduce a certain problematic. In the United States, you also get a life-size wax figure of Toussaint Louverture that goes on tour in 1802. Like, I was really pumped when I found that in the record. So those things are being produced outside to comment on it. That said, Haitian revolutionaries are appropriating things made outside of Saint-Domingue. So uniforms are something that get picked up and used by black soldiers by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, over the durée of the revolution. I found evidence of ceramics circulating as well, plain style, Wedgwood, sort of creamware ceramics. For those of you that vocabulary matters, it's like the slide at the beginning, which I would have liked. There are accessories too, small accessories like cockades, right? So for me, the story of appropriation and taking and plundering and reutilizing becomes really important for locating the object agency of black revolutionaries in different sites. Right? Jason?
Thank you, Professor. Amazing job. So my question was basically about these racist connotations that blacks in the Atlantic world didn't understand the value of a lot of these objects, but then it's shown that they do.
Right.
How is that reconciled in the day? Were people just willing to ignore that? Were they trying to sweep that under the rug so other people didn't realize that they were wrong? Or did it just stop because of communication?
In terms of how white actors perceive it at the time?
Yeah.
So there's a whole sliding scale of reaction. In some cases, there's an attempt to demean or to make it seem like a carnivalesque appropriation, right? To show the world turned upside down by the ways that black actors appropriate things like epaulets or books, for example. Others, though, are commenting. White observers are actually having to document that appropriation. At least white planters in Saint Domingue, because they're hoping to get it back through reparations if things go wrong. So there are ways that they have to admit that certain things are moving. But in terms of reconciling with that sort of call for understanding, savvy, that pushes against the ways that material culture is used to buttress racial hierarchies, very few white actors are willing to engage with that. But that doesn't mean that for black actors that wasn't a valuable ways of pushing forth their agenda. Right? In some ways, it becomes literally a material taking and appropriation. And there's a radicalness in that which I think deserves to be appreciated, even if white actors at the time couldn't make sense of it. Yeah.
So I hope you can hear me. Thank you. This was fabulous. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, I worked on the archaeological dig of President Madison, Montpelier. And I worked specifically on the enslaved homes, if you call them that, but of the domestic labor for Dolly Madison. And what we found was a lot of fine china in the enslaved, in those homes. And it was interesting. It's sort of the currency of intimacy. So there's obviously the pillage, that part of it. But there was also material goods used as intimate relationships. So Dolly Madison would she was a famous purveyor of French fine china. And as she moved through her collection, she would actually give it to her favorite enslaved persons. And interestingly enough, they went with her to the White House, and then famously, they helped her save the White House and the goods of the White House during the British, the 1818. So it's interesting how the relationship of the goods actually created these intimacies that you would think the enslaved people, I'm not going to help you save the White House, this bastion of our oppression. But in fact, it created this very specific and personal relationship that belied everything that was happening in the macro world. And so I think this is a fabulous intersection of everything that material goods meant between the enslaved and the enslavers and just everything that was happening, micro and macro.
Thank you so much. I think those days of Montpelier are so fascinating. I think, and it also points to how one thing isn't exactly, its meaning is not fixed, right? That as it moves, as it becomes a part of the context of relationships, whether it's crossing racial, gender, social divides, it takes on different meanings. And I think the example that you point to is key for that, right? For helping us think more creatively about the questions we might ask, right? Rather than a simple cast-off, there's a sort of set of relationships that ceramic, for example, inaugurates between Dolly and enslaved people, and then how enslaved people then might have used those ceramics within particular settings among themselves and the relationships they built around it. That's a whole other constellation, right? Yeah, exactly. So, I think it's worth pushing harder on things, the questions that we ask, to understand that they are dynamic, that they are in movement, and their circulation in particular affords us these kinds of opportunities for flashpoints, for exploring those relationships and opening up things that are just not about refinement. Sorry, Richard Bushman, but he's had a good go, right? So, and it's not just about vernacular cultures being preserved, right? Instead, there's a good deal of exciting mutability, which is important, I think, for its historical significance and for the ways that we can leverage them in our scholarship, but also in public venues like Montpelier.
Thank you, Ashley. That was so great. I don't know if this is working. I guess I'm in a little bit of an environmental studies mode, so when I was listening to you, I was just thinking about the kind of interplay of waste and decay. Mm-hmm. Because, like, as a historian, there's this stuff that you wish you could see but you can't, and then there's this surfeit of like hideous gilded objects that no one can get rid of. It's like, so I was sort of, I mean, as they were talking, I was sort of imagining the French Revolution as suddenly there's all this like very expensive trash. So like, we don't want this, but there's money in it. Like we have to get rid of it. And then there's the kind of the stuff that you can't find. So I guess I was just thinking about where does that kind of questions of waste kind of play into your thinking?
That's a great question. That's a fascinating question, especially then if you think about waste in enslaved populations and the way that that gets researched. I think I don't really engage with waste in the book, but I sort of end by thinking about what does and does not remain. Mm-hmm. And how do we wrestle with what does remain, the French Revolutionary crime, right? And what does not. And there I try to offer a couple of ways to think about that inequality in the material world as it comes down, to make a case that that's when interdisciplinarity matters most, actually, for dealing with what isn't there and trying to make it speak. So using archaeology, using as many sources as you can find from across literature, performance, historians, bailiwicks, right? Like even military records. I spent a lot of time in military records, which I didn't anticipate. But that kind of call for looking at the in-betweenness to rectify that a bit more, right? But yeah, you could do a whole other book on waste. Right. Thank you, Marcia.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. It may be an unfair question only insofar as it reaches beyond the chronological scope of the book, but all of these accounts of sort of the taking of objects from the lead and repurposing and the sale. Is there a repo man in this story? Later on, right? Are there claims? I think you alluded to it, sort of people hoping to get objects back. Can you tell a little bit about sort of the after story? Are there any successful attempts to get objects back?
So actually, there are. It's easiest with the high style stuff, which is just kind of one part of the book. But for example, the Gouverneur Morris couch that he buys, it eventually makes its way back to Versailles in the 1980s as part of the claims that kind of put it together. So there are ways that scholars, auctioneers, valuers are really into the provenance of those things and look to find them back. I know a little bit about the ways that refugees from Saint-Domingue, it's like it keeps repeating, they try to find their things too. And some, at various points during the revolution, return to the island and try to reclaim them. So the planter who showed up in 1791 was trying to take back the things that were his. But I guess I didn't follow so much the feedback loop of the objects, although that would be an important, one could argue, way that you see the contest continuing over who gets to own these objects and what they mean in certain situations. And for certain genres of objects, it's just a lot harder. Maps and prints, even though they proliferate, are very, very hard to trace their exact movement through hands. I guess Madame Tussauds life-size wax figures, she takes them out of Paris in the heat of revolution and plots them in London. And the slide of the decapitated heads is actually something she is said to have made in the heat of revolution and took with her to London. So I think There's an interesting, I guess, another layer of tussling over a reclamation that I guess is more prominent in some than other types of objects.
Friends, our hour is at hand, but before we adjourn, I hasten to add and to emphasize that Ashli's beautiful and brilliant book is available for purchase here this evening. I believe the author is going to be available here for an inscription as well. So without any further ado, please join me in thanking Ashli for a very stimulating talk.